Some people are saying asking Aboriginal people claim to be Aboriginal to provide DNA evidence for that before they access benefits is akin to, what the Nazis did to the Jews. Do you know we already ask people wanting to sponsor relatives over here, immigrants, that they can to provide a DNA test in some circumstances? It's perhaps not quite so Nazi-like as people wanting to make out. But on to culture wars. Now, forget Donald Trump. New bombshell evidence that adds to suspicions that US President Joe Biden is the real crook here. Biden's claimed he never ever discussed business dealings with his shady son, Hunter Biden. Never discussed that his son traded on Joe's position when he was vice president.
I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses, period.
But now a former business partner and friend of Hunter says that's false, and he will give evidence to a congressional committee. He is Devon Archer, that's him on the left, with Biden, and said he was there when Hunter got his dad on the phone to talk to his then boss, the head of a Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. Now, Burisma back then was being investigated by a prosecutor for corruption and was paying Hunter $1 million a year US to be on its board, despite his lack of experience. And no wonder. His father, Joe's vice president, was in charge of US-Ukrainian policy. In fact, Joe flew to Ukraine and demanded that this prosecutor be fired, supposedly for being inefficient. Biden even boasted about it.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, got fired.
Yes, the prosecutor was fired, the investigation fizzled, and when Biden stopped being vice president, hey, Hunter's salary at Burisma was quickly cut in half. Joining me is Rowan Dean, editor of The Spectator Australia and host of Outsiders of Sky News every Sunday at 9 a.m. Rowan Dean, great to see you as always. But, what makes this a cultural issue is that we have in the US Donald Trump persecuted, uphill, down dale, and now charged over alleged false bookkeeping entries for simply paying a porn star to shut up about him. But here we've got something mega bigger than that. And the American mainstream media has all but ignored it. Explain that.
Well, it's bizarre, isn't it? Because Mrs. Kafoops living in Woy Woy or Wagga Wagga probably knows more about the corruption of Joe Biden, the president of the free world, if she's been watching Sky News for the last few years or listening to the brilliant Australian journalist Miranda Devine. But than most people in America know about how corrupt their president is. And the reality is, we now know, it is now glaringly obvious that sitting in the White House is a corrupt president in the worst sense of the word. Now, corruption has many faces, takes many guises. You mentioned before Donald Trump and the whole 4 years of his entire presidency, allegations which here the ABC happily leapt on, sent their journalists all off to Washington to report on, spent a fortune doing huge documentaries on, reported it in the news whenever they possibly could about how Donald Trump was supposedly corrupt because supposedly the Russians had got him into the presidency somehow. Nobody bought that story, or nobody with half a brain bought that story. The ABC, I repeat myself, bought it lock, stock and barrel and put their finest journalists onto it. But the reality is, you have a president whose son has sold influence around the world in some of the most corrupt countries and in some of the most corrupt areas of the world, access to the vice president, as he then was, and now he's the president. So access to the most important man in the free world for millions of dollars. This is corruption at the very, very highest level. It doesn't matter if a parking inspector doesn't give a parking ticket to his mate, that's corruption, but it really doesn't influence or affect that many people. But here we have the leader of the free world engaged in a war, by the way, we're defending the Ukraine against Russia, two areas of the world which clearly have problems with corruption, and you have the leader of the free world up to his eyeballs in corruption, which we now know. Devon Archer, who will be appearing on Thursday in front of the House committee, was John Kerry's assistant, and he is spilling the beans about how this corruption has played out.
Yeah, well, in fairness to Joe Biden, these are allegations, very strong allegations, I have to say, a lot of circumstantial evidence, but he denies it and there's no proof. And it might just be that the person that faces the big questions are his son rather than him. But I have to say, at the very least, is a liar. I didn't discuss this with my son. I mean,
absolutely.
Give me a break. Rowan, how the mighty have fallen. I mean, global warming guru Greta Thunberg is now 20, not quite so cute, right? Doesn't quite get the attention anymore. And the cause of global warming is not quite so hot, so to speak. Now, she's just been arrested and fined in Sweden for blocking a road to stop oil trucks, you know. But what struck me most, Rowan, was how pathetically small this demonstration was. This is a woman who's led huge rallies. What does it tell you? That she's got, what, 6 people there with her or something?
Yeah, well, Greta was used, basically. The idea that we had some kind of teenage girl who had this amazing vision about the future of the world, this kind of Joan of Arc character, whenever it was 5 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago, who was preaching salvation to the planet for global warming. She herself quickly abandoned much of her own zealotry, preferring to go to nightclubs like any teenage girl should do, and joking about how you don't need to worry about climate change so much, and these sorts of jokes and things. She's not the Svengali or the cultural icon that she used to be, but simply because her goals have been achieved. She was a pawn in a game, and that game was to get countries like Australia and countries like Britain to go down the net zero path. Now, you go back to when Greta came onto the stage, the world stage. Net zero was sold as the holy grail. This was the great vision we all had to adopt. And it was Greta who was the spokesperson to galvanize the youth of the world, as well as the feeble-minded of the world, to adopt the mantra of net zero. It succeeded. So Greta's passed her use-by date because her message was received by gullible politicians like Scott Morrison here in Australia, and we are literally the poorer for it. Australia will be for decades the poorer for net zero. Certainly Britain is the poorer, certainly Germany is the poorer. All around the world, the message was received. Greta worked. She's done her job. Get rid of her now, discard her. She has nothing left to offer. She succeeded.
Yep, and now she just sits on the road with 4 or 5 friends getting arrested. Boy, what another few years, I don't know. Rowan Dean, thank you so much for your time.